French woman that had a painting hanging in her kitchen over a hot plate. And when an art evaluator visited her home, he recognized the old painting, and he urged her to have it appraised. The painting depicted Jesus being mocked before his crucifixion. In fact, the painting was titled simply, "Christ Mocked." And it turns out it was painted in 1280 by an Italian painter named Cimabue, a forefather of the Italian Renaissance. That painting had previously hung above a hot plate in an old woman's house, and it sold in an auction for $26.8 million. It was the most ever paid for a medieval painting. Pretty nice find for an old woman's house. A brother and sister in the United Kingdom were cleaning out their parents' house after their parents' death. They took a few items to an auction house to be appraised. One item was a tall vase with a fish image on it. To their surprise, the vase was made for a family of a Chinese emperor in the 18th century. Recently, this simple vase was auctioned off for $18 million. They found it up in the attic of the house. How can these amazing works of art go unnoticed for decades or even centuries? Well, it's because it takes someone with a special skill to see their worth. You know, everyone else looked at these paintings or ceramics and they saw something pretty, they saw something nice, but it took the trained art appraiser to look at them and see a masterpiece. You know, two different people look at the exact same thing and they see something vastly different. And it seems that to be that way in everything. You know, a woman tells about a friend of her who teaches first grade in Toronto, Canada. And this friend was teaching math to a class of 6-year-olds, including a group of newly arrived refugee children. And the lesson that day was on fractions. And the teacher explained the difference between a quarter and a half in fractions. And then she asked the class to write down whether they would prefer to have a quarter of a chocolate bar or a half of a chocolate bar. And the teacher was surprised by the results of that little quiz. As she looked over their papers, she noticed that many of the refugee children wrote down that they preferred to have a quarter of the chocolate bar rather than the half. Well, the teacher was concerned that these two students hadn't understood the lesson, but before she corrected their paper, she decided to ask one of them. Well, one little girl answered that more people could have more of the chocolate, and that's why she chose the quarter. You see, two groups of children looked at the same thing, a chocolate bar, and one group saw a delicious snack, while the other saw an opportunity to share something good with others. It's all in what you see. Now think about the important differences as we're going to deal with a Bible passage today and see how different people see different things in Bible passages. Just like I gave you 3 examples, 2 of them that had to do with art, and 1 of them that had to do with how children see things. And all 3 of them looked at how different people saw different things. And it's the same thing that has to do with things that have to do with the Bible. Would you turn with me to Matthew chapter 14? It really has to do with how we look at Bible things and how Jesus looked at things that have to do with us. All in how we look at Bible passages and how Jesus looks with how he deals with us, and how we look at what happens in the Bible. I'm going to start in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13. Matthew 14, verse 13. Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when he heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. Now before I go on, I want you to remember, Jesus was a man and had feelings like us. He had grown up with his cousin John, and he was sad because of John's death. Now, crowds of people were following Jesus, hoping to receive something from him, just when he wanted to be alone. What did he do? Did he go out and shoo them away? Well, in verse 14, when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and look at his first reaction. He felt compassion on them, and he healed the sick. And in verse 15, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late, so send the crowds away that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Now, as the day passed, the disciples got tired. They asked Jesus to send the people away. It wasn't just a matter of people, becoming tired. They were concerned that the people, weren't going to find enough food to eat in the surrounding countryside. But did you pick up something that Jesus said that was really, really strange? I have never realized. I've read this 50 times or more, and I have never picked up something that Jesus said here that was really, really strange. He said they don't need to go away, but he said something to the disciples that I had never picked up on before. He turned to the disciples and he said, "You give them something to eat." He didn't say, "I'll feed them." He told the disciples, "You give them something to eat." What do you think the disciples thought at that moment? Are you kidding me? Look how many people are here. What do you expect us to do, Jesus? Really? How in the world are we going to feed them? You're the master, and you want us to feed them? It's time for them. We already asked you to send them away, and you want us to feed them? What do you think they really thought? Can you imagine what was going through their mind at this time? Now, we need to understand that Jesus often led his disciples into challenging situations. This wasn't the first time that he had sent them out to do things and put them in situations that required courage, insight, and radical faith. This was no exception. But why would he do that here? Well, I think it's because he saw something they didn't see. He saw the world through God's eyes. He wasn't afraid. He saw what God could do. Do we? I don't usually. He saw a world in which anything was possible if you were aligned with God. Seeing the world as Jesus sees it, though, begins with compassion. That's how he began this whole thing. Is compassion your default setting when you look at people around you? Jesus looked at everyone he met with the eyes of compassion. When Jesus heard what happened to John, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. He heard of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And when he landed, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. When he wanted to be alone, when he saw them, the first thing he did was heal their sick. Football fans probably know of Joe Burrow. I'm not a football fan. I didn't know about him. I read about him. Burrow led his team, the LSU Bengal Tigers, to a national championship in football. He also won the 2019 Heisman Trophy as the nation's most outstanding player. At the ceremony in which he accepted that trophy, he used his moment in the spotlight to speak some words of encouragement to the kids back in his hometown, Athens, Ohio. You may know that Athens, Ohio is one of the poorest towns in the Appalachian region. He started crying during his speech, and through the tears, Burrow said, "I'm up here for all those kids in Athens and Athens counties that go home to not a lot of food on the table, and they're hungry after school." And then he said, "You guys can be up here too." And within hours of Burrow's words, a man in Athens County named Will Draybold set up a fundraising site to raise money for the Athens County food pantries. And he was counting on Joe Burrow's words of compassion to inspire others. And he was right. Curious fans began searching for information on Athens County, Ohio. And within just 2 days, generous folks around the country donated $260,000 to the Athens County Food Pantry. All of this because they were moved by Burrow's compassion for needy kids in his community. All because of that one speech he gave. It's amazing what can happen. Compassion was Jesus' default setting. That's what he goes to immediately. That's what he is. I hate to say it. I hate to admit it. It's not my default setting. That's not what I go to immediately. Compassion was at the very core of Jesus' nature. It's the reason why he gave up his power and authority as part of his Godhead and took on human flesh and human weakness and walked among us. Jesus' compassion for us is what led him to die on the cross for us. It was the only way to save us from our sins and restore us to God. I try to do better, and I hope to do much better. I want you to notice again through the opening words to this story. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. What's Matthew referring to? What just happened? Well, it's important and tragic because Jesus had just found out that John, his cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded by King Herod. Can you imagine your cousin had been really treated badly and then beheaded by King Herod? What if that had happened to somebody you had loved dearly? Somebody you had loved and admired? Undoubtedly, Jesus wanted to be left alone, sometime to grieve for his cousin's death. But the needy crowds followed him and they wanted something. And Jesus wanted to be left alone. they were desperate to hear his teaching or receive something, a healing touch or something from him. At this point in time, I probably would have gotten mad when I saw it. I probably would have asked the disciples, please ask them to leave. Please tell them to go away. And yet, Jesus looked at the crowd and immediately went out in the crowd and started healing them. I heard a quote several years ago that said, there's one thing that God cannot do. He cannot see a crowd. He only sees individuals. He only sees children of God. That's true with Jesus. He didn't see a crowd. He saw individuals made in the image of God who were immensely precious in God's sight. And he saw that they were hurting. And he had compassion on them, thousands of them. If we can operate from a place of compassion, we can see others as God sees them. And suddenly, we can want to help. We want to heal. We'll do whatever it takes because these people are valuable to God, and that can make them, if we can learn like him, make them valuable to us. Because seeing the world as Jesus sees the world inevitably leads to acts of compassion. If you're like me, we have lots and lots of thoughts of compassion, but not lots of acts of compassion. You know, seeing the world through Jesus' eyes should lead to acts of love and compassion. We may feel that we don't have enough resources to make a dent in something we feel compassion about. But it's amazing what can happen when Jesus gets involved. Have you ever thought about that crowd that was out there that Jesus was talking to? It says that he fed, the crowd was 5,000 men. But it also talks about women and children there. It just says there was 5,000 men. Did each one bring his wife? Did each one bring children? If each one brought their wife, that's 10,000. If each one brought 2 children, that's 20,000. We don't know how many were there. We don't know how many they fed. We know there's at least 5,000 there. There could have been 20,000. There could have been 30,000. We don't know. We know there was 5,000. He could have fed 30,000. We know there was 5,000. We know it called a large crowd. What's Jesus called a large crowd? We know there were a lot of people there. And Jesus told his disciples, you give them something to eat. And the disciples answered, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I have a question for you. Do you think Jesus was disappointed when the disciples said, how are we going to do that? What do you think? Do you think he was disappointed, or do you think he knew they were going to say that? I just wonder. I really wonder if he knew, or do you think he thought maybe Peter was going to jump up and say, let's get to it? Or was he disappointed when they came back and said, how are we going to do that? I just wonder what happened, when that happened. Jesus said, bring them here to me. Why didn't Jesus make it rain manna and cover the whole area? Why didn't he just perform a miracle and make fish rain from the clouds and everybody pick up the fish and bread? Why did he make the disciples hand out everything to them? I think there's a reason. He wanted the disciples to be involved. Jesus used what was at hand to meet the people's needs. It's a simple principle. It's always the first step to a miracle. Has God ever done this to you? How should you respond? When you can't get something to work, how should you respond? I think in the same way that the disciples did when they didn't know what to do. You don't have enough time to do anything, to work for church, to volunteer, to do anything. Then you take your calendar, you take your computer schedule, and you pray and you bring it to God, and you say, Lord, I don't have time to volunteer. And Jesus looks at your schedule and says, bring it to me. And you wait for the miracle. You take your bank account, you said, Lord, I don't have any cash to give to the food pantry, to the church, to the whatever fund we're doing, whatever it is. And Jesus says, here, bring it here to me, and expect the miracle, because you brought it in faith, and you do your part, and you expect the miracle. You hold up your heart to the Lord, and you say, Lord, I have tried my very best, and I don't have it in my heart to love that person. It's impossible for me, and I need your heart, your help. And Jesus looks at your heart and says, bring it here to me. And you expect a miracle. You know, seeing the world through Jesus' eyes starts with compassion. Both thoughts of compassion and acts of compassion.